My name is Rebecca, and I have been working for the same company for over 14 years, rising up through the ranks to project manager, coordinating all of their most complex projects. I found out today they gave my job to a 23-year-old who had never run a single project in her life. My boss called me into his office to tell me how much the company valued me and slid a single sheet of paper across the desk with a smile he saved for investors and offered me a $200 a month raise. Before tax. On a salary of $40,000 a year, that came to less than 5%, and we both knew it. I did not argue. I did not beg for the promotion I had earned and been refused. I did not remind him of the 12 years, the missed weekends, the openings I had run while other people stood up and took the applause. I did not remind him of the many times he had taken credit for my work. I simply smiled back at him. I said thank you for the feedback, and I walked out of that office as quietly as I had walked into it. He looked relieved. He thought he had handled me. He went back to his email, believing the whole thing was settled. He had no idea what he had just done. He did not know that the quiet woman who said thank you and closed his door without a sound had already made up her mind, and that within 2 years, I would walk back through the front doors of that company as the person now running the entire operation, while he packed 12 years of his own career into a cardboard box. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that afternoon, and the office, and that single sheet of paper, because you need to understand exactly how invisible I had been made before you can understand what it finally took to be seen. I walked back to my desk that afternoon, past the framed photographs on the hallway wall. Restaurants I had built, openings I had run, ribbon cuttings where he stood in the center of the frame, holding the oversized scissors, beaming, while I stood off to one side, holding the binder that had made the entire night possible. I sat down and I did the arithmetic in my head, because doing arithmetic in my head is one of the many things I am quietly very good at. $200 a month, before tax, on $40,000 a year. John Foster, the man who had just offered it to me, the man I had personally watched fail to sort a single column in a spreadsheet, was earning more than $100,000. The going rate for the work I actually did, the work I had quietly been doing for years, was $90,000 a year. I did not cry. I opened my laptop and pulled up the tracker for the Denver opening. 41 days out, 312 line items, every one of them mine. And somewhere in the middle of that spreadsheet, I felt something go still and cold inside me, the way a kitchen goes quiet in the last few seconds before the first ticket of service. That was the day I decided. I just did not yet know everything that decision would cost the people who had spent 12 years deciding I was not ready. My title at Edwards Hospitality Group was Project Manager. What I actually did had very little to do with that title. Edwards was a chain of high-end restaurants, 12 of them spread across 4 cities, the kind of places with 12-week wait lists and chefs whose names you would recognize if you cared about that sort of thing. Raymond Edwards had built it from a single room above a delicatessen, and for all his faults, and there were many, the man could spot a location and a chef. What he could not do, what nobody at the top of that company could do, was build the actual restaurants. Turn an empty shell on a city block into a working room with a kitchen that passed inspection and a dining room that opened on the promised date. That was me. For 12 years, I managed every phase of development: concept, design, pre-construction, build-out, opening. I read the leases, all 40 pages of them, and I found the things landlords buried on page 31, the HVAC obligations and the restoration clauses, and the rent escalators that would have cost us a fortune 2 years down the line. I knew the permitting officials in 4 cities by their first names. I knew which inspectors were thorough and which ones you could not rush, and which ones had a kid playing high school baseball, because the kind of work I did got done in the small spaces between people, and I paid attention to people. Let me tell you about Chicago, because Chicago is the one that mattered. We were 2 weeks out from opening our flagship on the near north side. 11 weeks of build-out, a chef poached from a 2-star place in New York, a guest list for the soft opening that included a food critic who could make or break the room, and 14 days before service, the general contractor walked off the job. A payment dispute that was not even ours, something between him and a subcontractor, but he pulled his whole crew and left me standing in a half-finished dining room with exposed conduit hanging out of the ceiling and a chef having a quiet breakdown by the pass. I did not call John. There was no point calling John. I called 3 people I knew, 2 of whom owed me favors, and 1 of whom I would now owe. And within 72 hours, I had a new crew on site working double shifts. I slept in that restaurant for 9 nights. I ate cold pad thai at 2 in the morning, sitting on an overturned bucket, while an electrician I had known for 6 years rewired a panel. And we opened on schedule. The critic came. The review was a love letter. John gave the toast at the opening. He stood up in front of the staff and the investors, and Raymond Edwards himself, and he talked about vision, and about belief, and about how proud he was of what his team had accomplished. He used the word team the way some people use the word God, often and without any real understanding of it. He did not mention my name. I was in the back, in the same clothes I had been wearing for 2 days, making sure the wine service did not fall apart. That is what the title did not say. I should tell you about John Foster properly, because you need to understand him to understand the rest. John was Raymond's nephew, his sister's boy. Raymond built the company from nothing, and Raymond loved his sister, and his sister loved her son. And that, in its entirety, is the story of how John Foster came to be the acting vice president of operations at a company he could not have run a single department of on his own. I want to be fair to him, because being fair to him makes the point better than being cruel would. John had exactly one real talent, and it was a genuine one. He was extraordinary in a room. He had a way of leaning back in his chair and saying "great question" that made a senior executive feel like they were in the presence of a serious mind. He dressed well. He remembered the names of people's spouses. He could take a complicated situation and tell a simple, confident story about it that made everyone in the meeting feel calm. In a different company, in a role with no actual operational responsibility, John would have made a perfectly good ambassador. The problem was the work. John could not do the work. And I do not mean that he was weak at it. I mean that I once watched him, in a planning meeting, try to sort a budget spreadsheet by date and instead drag a single column out of alignment with all the others, so that every line of figures was now attached to the wrong project. 200 rows of nonsense. Then he frowned at the screen, announced that the file was corrupted, and called IT. I fixed it myself that evening after he had gone home. I never told him. There was no profit in telling him. What John was world-class at, what I have to give him credit for, was taking credit. He had refined it into something close to an art form. The pattern never varied. I would prepare the full briefing for a meeting, the deck, the budget, the risk register, the contingency plan, all of it. I would send it to John the night before, and in the meeting, John would present my thinking as his own, smoothly, confidently, and then, the moment someone asked a question he could not answer, which was any question of real substance, he would turn to me with a generous wave of the hand and say, "Rebecca can walk you through the detail." The thinking was always his, the detail was always mine. That is exactly how it works when you are, in the eyes of the company, the detail. For 12 years I told myself it did not matter who got the credit, as long as the work got done and the restaurants opened and the people I cared about kept their jobs. I told myself I was above it. I think a lot of women my age were raised to tell ourselves that. Keep your head down, do excellent work, and eventually someone will notice. Eventually, the right person will see. Someone did notice, in the end, just not the someone I expected, and not at the company where I had buried 12 years of my life. The news came in an all-staff email on a Tuesday morning, which should have told me everything, because at Edwards Hospitality Group, good news arrived in person and bad news arrived by email. John Foster was being made Vice President of Operations. Permanently. The acting was coming off the title. And the Senior Project Manager role, the one he was vacating, the role that had been functionally mine for years, in everything except the title and the salary, was going to Melissa Edwards. I read it 3 times. Melissa was Raymond's daughter. She had graduated from college in May with a degree in communications. It was now June. She was 23 years old, and by every account I ever heard, she was a perfectly pleasant young woman who had never in her life managed anything more complex than the social calendar of a sorority. I did not blame her, and I want to be clear about that, because it matters later. You do not blame the water for running downhill. You blame the people who built the channel. But I sat at my desk and I read that email a third time, and on the third reading, I finally understood the exact shape of the rest of my career at that company. It was the shape of a ceiling. A nice ceiling. $40,000 and a ceiling. Melissa would hold my title and earn more than I did, and I would train her, because of course I would be the one to train her. And in 2 years, she would move up and someone else would be brought in above me, and I would train them too. Forever. That was the offer. That was the whole offer, laid out in a Tuesday morning email, and the raise was just the bow on top of it. Because it was that same week that John called me into his office about the $200 a month. I understand now that he genuinely believed it would settle things. I have thought about this a great deal. John had watched me be loyal and reasonable and uncomplaining for 12 years, and he had made the mistake that powerful but unobservant people always make. He had confused my patience for the absence of a spine. He thought $200 a month and a pat on the head would buy another 12 years. He had handled me before, after all. Why would this time be any different? I went home that night. I did not call my sister. I did not call a friend. I did not vent to anyone. I poured a glass of wine and set it on the kitchen table and did not drink it. And then I did something I had not done in 12 years. I opened my resume. It was almost funny, updating it, in a bleak sort of way. Every single line I typed was true, and not one of them matched the job I actually held on paper. Managed multi-city restaurant development pipeline across 4 markets. True. Led cross-functional teams spanning corporate leadership, operations, design, and construction. True. Owned budget, timeline, and risk for openings exceeding $2 million each. True. Served as primary liaison between corporate and the local restaurant teams and external partners. All of it true, every word, and all of it work I had done under the title of project manager for $40,000 a year, while a man who could not sort a spreadsheet collected 6 figures for standing in front of it and smiling. I sent the resume to 4 companies that night, the 4 best in our part of the industry, the 4 that a sensible, realistic person would have told me not to waste my time on. I told myself the worst thing that could happen was silence, and silence was only a quieter version of what I already had. Then I went to bed, and I slept better than I had slept in over a year. There is a particular kind of peace that comes the moment you stop waiting to be rescued and decide to rescue yourself. I did not have a plan yet. I only had a decision. But the decision alone changed how I slept. I found out later what John said the next morning. One of the assistants told me, months afterward, when it no longer mattered, or rather when it had come to matter in an entirely different way. The morning after the announcement, John was in a meeting with the chief operating officer and with Melissa, walking them through what he called the operations vision for the year ahead. It was, I should say, my operations vision, the strategy document I had drafted 6 weeks earlier, now with his name on the cover page. At some point, the chief operating officer asked a reasonable question. He asked whether the company was exposed on institutional knowledge, whether there was a risk that key people might leave, and whether Rebecca in particular, given the changes, might be a flight risk. And John leaned back in his chair, in that way he had, and he smiled, and he said, "Don't worry about Rebecca. I've handled her. She's on board." I have handled her. He said it the way you say you have handled a problem with the plumbing. A leak, dealt with. A nuisance, managed. I think about that sentence more than I should admit, even now, from where I sit today. Not because it wounded me, although it did. I think about it because it was, in the end, the single most honest thing John Foster ever said about the 12 years we worked together, and he said it as a reassurance to his bosses. He had handled me. He really believed it. And that belief, more than the raise, more than the announcement, more than Melissa and her communications degree, is the reason for everything that happened next. That same afternoon, my phone buzzed on my desk. A personal email to my personal account, not the company one. It was from George Robinson. George was the Chief Operating Officer of Meridian Hospitality Group, which, depending on how you counted, was either the largest or the second largest operator in our corner of the industry. He was a serious man with a serious reputation, the kind of executive who had actually come up through operations and never forgot it. I knew George the way you come to know people in any small industry, from conferences and panels and a handful of tense negotiations over the years, where our development timelines had collided in the same city, and someone sensible had to sit down and work out who broke ground first. I had been the sensible one in several of those negotiations. George, it turned out, had remembered. His email was 4 lines long. He asked, with no real explanation, whether I might be able to come and see him on Friday at 2. It was Thursday afternoon when I read it. I sat at my desk in the open-plan office, with John's glass-walled corner office behind me and Melissa's brand-new desk a few feet away, where someone had already placed a small succulent and a framed inspirational quote about leadership, and I opened the company leave portal and booked the following day off. Personal appointment. My hand was perfectly steady on the mouse, and I remember being faintly surprised by that, because my heart was going like a drum. I replied to George in 2 lines. 2 o'clock on Friday worked. I would be there. Meridian's offices were everything Edwards's offices were not. They were quiet. They were expensive in the particular way that does not announce itself. Good carpet and real art on the walls, and a receptionist who knew my name before I gave it. George came out to meet me himself, which I noticed, and walked me back to a small conference room with a window and a pot of genuinely good coffee, which I also noticed. Small signals. I had spent 12 years reading small signals. George did not waste my time. He poured the coffee himself, sat down across from me, and got to it. He told me he had admired my work for a long time, and then he said the thing I had spent 12 years waiting for someone with actual power to say out loud. "Rebecca," he said, "I am going to be direct with you because I think you'll appreciate it. It is fairly well known in this industry that you have been carrying John Foster for years. People talk. I have heard your name attached to 3 of the cleanest restaurant openings on the East Coast, and I have heard his name on the press releases for those same 3 openings. I know the difference. So does everyone who actually does this work." I did not trust my voice in that moment, so I said nothing. I just held his gaze and let him keep going, and I focused very hard on the steam coming off the coffee so that my eyes would behave. He offered me the role of Senior Project Manager at Meridian Hospitality Group. $100,000 a year to start. Annual performance reviews, real ones, conducted by people who would actually look at the work. A bonus structure tied directly to openings delivered on time and on budget, which was to say, a bonus structure tied to the exact thing I had been doing for 12 years entirely for free. I held my composure. Holding my composure is, as I have said, one of the things I am best at in this world, and I had never in my life been more grateful for the skill. I did not gasp. I did not tear up. I did not thank him too fast or too much, which is the tell of a desperate person. And whatever else I was in that room, I was not going to let myself look desperate. Instead, I did the only thing that would tell George Robinson that he was hiring the real article and not just a bruised employee grabbing for a lifeboat. I talked shop for half an hour. I asked about Meridian's development pipeline and their pain points, and I mentioned, lightly, the 2 openings of theirs that I happened to know were running behind schedule, because part of my job at Edwards had always been knowing what the competition was doing. I told him precisely where I thought their pre-construction process was leaking money, based on nothing but the public permits and my own experience. And I watched George's face change as he realized that I was not interviewing for the job. I was already sitting in that chair, doing it. Nearly everything he described in that role was work I was already doing at Edwards. The only differences were the title, the money, and the respect. and the name that would go on the press release. We agreed I would start in 3 weeks. I signed the contract before I left the building, in blue ink, with a pen George handed me across the table. I kept the pen. I still have it. It sits in a cup on my desk, and I am looking at it right now. On Monday morning, I handed in my notice. 2 weeks, exactly as my contract required, in writing, copied to Human Resources, polite down to the final comma. I have always believed in leaving a place properly, no matter how it treated you. Partly that is character, and partly, I will admit, it is strategy, because the world is smaller than people think, and you never know who you will need. John did not take it well. He called me into his office within the hour, and this time his feet were not up on the desk. He stood behind it, and he told me, with the particular confidence of a man who has never in his life read a contract closely, that my employment agreement contained a non-compete clause and a non-disclosure clause, and that by going to Meridian, I would be in breach of both. He said the word breach several times. I think he liked the sound of it. I let him finish. I have learned the value of letting a certain kind of man finish. Then I reminded him, gently, of a few facts. I reminded him that I had started at Edwards Hospitality Group 14 years earlier as an administrative assistant on $22,000 a year, that I had been promoted 4 times since then, and that not one of those 4 promotions had ever come with a new contract. The agreement I had actually signed, at the age of 26, said nothing whatsoever about non-competes, because back then, nobody in that company imagined that the new administrative assistant would one day be worth poaching. I had read it that weekend, the whole yellowing thing, cover to cover. John had not. John had simply assumed there was a clause, because John assumed his way through life, and it had always worked before. I also mentioned, since we were on the subject of the law, that a non-compete that broad would very likely be unenforceable in any case, because there is the small matter of a person's right to earn a living in their own profession, and courts tend to take a dim view of contracts that try to take that away. His face did something complicated and unpleasant, and then John Foster, who 2 weeks earlier had offered me $200 a month and a pat on the head, leaned across the desk and offered to raise my salary, on the spot, from $40,000 to $65,000. $65,000. In a single afternoon. A $25,000 raise that he apparently had the authority to grant all along, produced out of thin air the moment he realized I was actually leaving. And if you want to know what I had been worth to that company the entire time, and exactly how much they had been counting on me never finding out, there is your answer. It was sitting right there on John's panicked face. I told him I would think about it. I did not need to think about it. But I have learned that there is no profit in slamming a door when you can simply walk through it and let it swing shut behind you on its own. I said that my resignation stood. I finished my 2 weeks. I left the Denver tracker in flawless order, every line item current, every risk flagged, every contact noted, because the people working on that project deserved that from me, even if the company did not, and because, whatever else was true, I was not John. Then I walked out of the doors of Edwards Hospitality Group on a Friday evening, and I did not look back. And I want to be honest with you about something. Walking across that parking lot in the evening light, I thought that leaving was the end of it. Find a place that valued me, earn what I was worth, and live well. That was the plan, and it would have been a good life. But the people I left behind in that building were about to start making mistakes, one after another after another. And within 2 years, those mistakes would carry me right back through the front doors of that company and set me down on the other side of John Foster's desk, with his entire career sitting in my hands. I could not have planned what came next if I had tried for a year. I did not have to. They did it to themselves. I want to be careful here, because there is a version of this story where I walked into Meridian on my first day with a cold, complete plan to destroy Edwards Hospitality Group, and that version is not true. The true version is better, and I would rather you believed the true one. I did not plot revenge. I did not spend my evenings drawing diagrams on a wall. I simply did my job, extraordinarily well, in a building where, for the first time in my entire adult working life, doing my job extraordinarily well was actually noticed. It is a strange thing being valued. It took me months to stop bracing for the moment it would be taken away. In my first week at Meridian, I caught a problem in a Boston lease, the same kind of buried restoration clause I had been catching for years, and I flagged it in a meeting, and the room thanked me. Just thanked me. Nobody took the credit. Nobody turned to me and asked me to walk them through the detail while keeping the headline for himself. My name went on the memo. The first time it happened, I went into the ladies' room afterward and stood at the sink for a minute, because 12 years is a long time to go without the simple experience of being given credit for your own work. And it does something to you when it finally comes. Within 6 months, I had taken the 2 stalled openings George had mentioned in our very first meeting and delivered them both. One of them I brought in 11 days early and 4% under budget, and George sent an email to the entire leadership team about it, with my name in the subject line. Within a year, I was being invited to sit in on strategy sessions, rooms that a senior project manager had no formal business being in. George had a habit of pulling me into those rooms and then sitting back and watching the senior people in them go through the exact realization he had gone through. The slow understanding that I was the person who actually knew how things got built and how they fell apart, and why. Meridian's strategy, set from the very top, was growth through acquisition. The plan was to buy up strong regional players, brands with loyal customers and good locations but weak management, and fold them into the group and run them properly. And one afternoon, about 14 months after I had started, I was sitting in one of those strategy sessions when someone put a slide up on the screen. A list of acquisition targets. Companies that were vulnerable. Strong on brand, weak on operations. Companies whose development pipelines had quietly come apart at the seams. Edwards Hospitality Group was on the list. Third from the top. I did not put it there. I want to be completely clear about that, because it is the part that still gives me a kind of grim satisfaction. I did not have to put Edwards on that list. The market had already noticed exactly what I had known from the inside for years. In the 14 months since I had walked across that parking lot, Edwards had come apart. They had missed 2 openings, badly. One of them so badly it became a story in a trade publication. There had been a lease dispute in Chicago, in the very city where I had once slept on an overturned bucket for 9 nights. The kind of dispute that any competent person would have caught in the red lines before signing. There had been a build-out in Atlanta that ran so far over budget that it, too, made the trade press. The institutional knowledge that had held that company together for 12 years had walked out the door in blue ink, and not one of the people left behind could read a spreadsheet well enough to notice that the building was on fire. George turned to me in that meeting. Of course he did. And he asked me the question I think some part of me had been waiting my entire professional life to be asked. Rebecca, you know this one from the inside. What do you think? What do you think is a question I answered very carefully. I did not say what was actually in my heart, which was that this was the company that had paid me $40,000 to do a $100,000 job for 12 years, and then handed my title to a 23-year-old and offered me the price of a nice dinner each month to stay quiet about it. I did not say any of that. Instead, I said the true and professional thing, which, as it happened, was far more devastating than anything personal could have been. I told the room that Edwards had a genuinely premium brand sitting on top of a genuinely broken operation. I said the brand was worth real money, real loyalty, real locations that could not be replicated, and that the operation underneath it could be repaired by people who actually knew what they were doing. And then I said the sentence that I think sealed it. I said that I knew exactly where the bodies were buried inside that company. Every weak lease. Every project running on hope and a prayer. Every overrun. Because I had built the systems that were now rotting from the inside without anyone left to maintain them. George asked me to lead the due diligence. Me. The administrative assistant who had been promoted 4 times without ever once being given a new contract. So, I led it. And here is the thing about due diligence on a company you built half of yourself. There is nowhere for anyone to hide. And what I was about to find buried in those books would do more damage to John Foster than anything I could ever have invented. I will get to that. I went through the Edwards books the way only a person who had personally created half of those books could go through them. I found the overruns John had been hiding, not just from the trade press, but from his own board of directors, buried in reclassified line items and optimistic forecasts that anyone who understood the underlying projects would know were fantasy. I found the openings that Melissa had been nominally responsible for, where the local teams had been quietly begging corporate for the direction and the decisions that simply never came, because the person whose job it was to give them had a communications degree and 14 months of experience, and had been set up to fail by a father who loved her too much to let her earn anything for herself. And I built the model that valued the Edwards brand honestly, that priced in the full cost of repairing the operation, and that showed the board of Meridian Hospitality Group, in numbers that not even John Foster could have spun in a meeting, exactly how much money there was to be made in acquiring my old company and running it the way it should have been run all along. The board approved the acquisition. And then they did something I had not asked for, and I am not going to pretend to you that I had not hoped for it, because I had, in the quiet way you hope for things you do not quite let yourself say out loud. They asked who should run the acquired company once the deal closed and Edwards was folded into the group. George did not hesitate. He said one word. He said my name. It took 8 months from that meeting to the day the deal closed. I am going to spare you the machinery of it, the legal filings and the regulatory approvals and the endless integration planning, because that machinery is exactly the part that revenge stories always leave out, and it was, in truth, almost the entire thing. I worked harder in those 8 months than I have ever worked in my life, harder than the 9 nights in Chicago, harder than any opening. By the end of it, I was no longer the senior project manager who had identified a target on a slide. I was the executive who was going to run it. On the morning the acquisition formally closed, I drove to the Edwards Hospitality Group corporate offices. I parked in the same lot where, 14 years earlier, I had sat in a borrowed suit with my hands shaking on the wheel, working up the nerve to go in and interview for a job as an administrative assistant. I sat there for a moment, in a much better car, in a suit that was my own, and then I walked in through the front doors as the person now responsible for the entire operation. John Foster was waiting in what was still, for the next several minutes, his office. He knew I was coming. He had to have known by then how the pieces fit together. But knowing a thing and feeling it arrive are two very different experiences, and I watched the difference play out on his face as I came through the door. He stood up. Some old instinct that sitting behind a desk for a person who outranks you no longer works, and on some animal level, he understood that the ranking had changed. I watched the recognition come over him in stages, and I am not going to lie to you and tell you that I took no satisfaction in it. I took a great deal. I did not gloat. I had decided, in advance, that I would not, and I held to it. Partly that was because gloating was beneath the position I now held, and partly it was because the facts of the situation did all the gloating that was required without any help from me. I told John, with a representative from Human Resources sitting beside me, and the paperwork squared and correct on the desk between us, that as part of the integration, the Vice President of Operations role was being eliminated, and that his employment with the company was being terminated in accordance with the terms of his contract. The terms of which, I told him, I had read very carefully, every comma of them. He said a number of things. He said several of them loudly. At one point, he leaned across the desk and told me that the company would not last a month without him, which I have to say was a remarkable sentence to hear from a man whom I had personally watched fail to sort a spreadsheet, a man who had not produced an accurate document in the entire time I had known him. I let him say it. I had let him say a great many things over the years. Then, when he had finished, he was walked out of the building, with his personal belongings in a box, in the middle of a Tuesday morning. The formal notice followed by email that afternoon, because I knew that John had always preferred to deliver bad news by email, and I am, whatever else you make of me, a great believer in consistency. Melissa was a different matter, and I want to be honest with you about that, because the honest version is the one that matters. Melissa had not been the architect of anything that was done to me. She was not John. She was a young woman who had been handed a job she was nowhere near ready for, by a father who loved her and, in loving her badly, had done her no favors at all. She had spent 14 months drowning in public, in a role she could not perform, watched by an entire company that knew exactly why she had it. That is its own kind of cruelty, and Raymond Edwards, not Melissa, had been the one to inflict it. I let her go as well. The role had to be eliminated, and there was no honest way around that. But I did it privately, in a quiet office with the door closed, and not by email. I gave her a genuine reference for the things she actually could do, because there were some, and she was not without ability, only without preparation. And I did something that nobody had ever bothered to do for her, which was to sit with her for half an hour and talk honestly about what she might be good at, if she were ever willing to start at the bottom of something and learn it properly, the way I once had, the way real careers are actually built. I told her that being the owner's daughter had not been a gift, it had been a weight, and that the kindest thing anyone could do for her was take it off. She cried a little. Then she thanked me, and I believe she meant it. I have thought about Melissa more than I ever expected I would. Karma, I have come to understand, is not always a hammer. Sometimes it is just the truth, arriving at last in a room where someone is finally willing to speak it. The best moment of my professional life did not involve John Foster, and it did not involve Melissa Edwards. It did not involve Raymond, who sold his company and took his money, and I am told retired to Florida, and whom I never saw again. The best moment had nothing to do with any of the people who had wronged me. A week after the deal closed, I called an all-staff meeting of the entire Edwards Hospitality Group. Everyone. The corporate office in the room, and the local restaurant teams in all 4 cities patched in by video, the general managers and the assistant managers, and the hosts and the line cooks, the people who had spent years watching good ideas die in meetings they were never invited to attend. I knew those people. That was the thing John had never once understood in all his years of leaning back in his chair and saying team. He looked at an organizational chart and saw boxes. I looked at the same company and saw the assistant in Chicago who had flagged that lease problem 2 full years before it finally blew up and had been ignored by everyone above her. I saw the young man in Atlanta who had been quietly doing a project manager's entire job on an assistant manager's pay, the exact way I once had, waiting for someone to notice. I saw the talent that had been sitting inside that company the entire time, underappreciated, overlooked, passed over, getting on with the work anyway, because that is what people like that do, waiting, year after year, for someone in a position of power to simply turn around and see them. I stood up at the front of that room, and the tension in it was something you could feel through the screens. Everyone in that company knew what an acquisition usually means. It means layoffs. It means the new owners coming in to cut, and everyone in the room and on those screens was braced for it. I could see it in their shoulders. I could see it in the way nobody was quite looking at me. So I said the most important thing first. I did not make them wait for it. I told them that their jobs were safe, every single one of them. I told them that we had not bought this company in order to gut it. We had bought it because the brand they had built with their own hands, in their own kitchens and dining rooms, night after night, was worth saving. And that the people in that room and on those screens were the entire reason it was worth saving. I told them that the days of good work going unseen at this company were over. Finished. I told them that the senior roles that had just been vacated, the ones at the very top, would be filled from inside, from among the people in front of me, on the basis of merit and nothing else. And I told them that I knew their names. That I was not a stranger brought in from outside to look at them as line items on a spreadsheet. That I had stood where many of them were standing, on the wrong side of the credit, for 12 years, in this exact company, and that I had not forgotten a minute of it. And then the room did something I will remember when I have forgotten nearly everything else in my life. They stood up. All of them. In the room and on the screens, 4 cities of them, and they applauded. And it was not the polite applause you give because the meeting is over and it is the expected thing to do. It was the other kind. The kind that starts, and then gets louder instead of softer. The kind that goes on too long. The kind that people are almost embarrassed by even as they are doing it because they cannot quite stop themselves. Some of them were crying. The assistant from Chicago was crying. I could see her on the screen, in a break room in a city where I had once slept on a bucket to save her restaurant. And she was crying and clapping, and she did not look away from the camera. I stood there at the front of that room, and I let it wash over me. 12 years of it. And I am not going to tell you that I held my composure, because I did not. For once in my life, in the one moment when it would have been easiest to perform the calm, capable, unbothered woman I had performed for so long, I did not even try. I let them see it on my face. I think they needed that. I think I needed it too. I promoted the assistant from Chicago. Her name is Dana, and she runs development for 2 of our cities now, and she is, I will say it plainly, better at the job at her age than I was at mine. The young man from Atlanta is a project manager now, with his own name on his own press releases, and the first time I saw one of those releases come across my desk with his name where John's would once have been, I printed it out, which I never do, and I put it in a drawer, and it is still there. We delivered 4 openings on time and on budget in our first full year, the company that the trade press had been writing obituaries for 18 months earlier. The brand recovered. The numbers George and I had put in front of that board turned out, if anything, to be conservative. I do not hear from John Foster. I am told he has had some difficulty finding a comparable role, which does not surprise me, because the thing John was actually selling all those years was not competence, it was the appearance of it, and that particular product depends entirely on having someone like me standing just out of frame, holding the binder. Without that, there is not very much left to sell. I do hear from Melissa, once or twice a year, an email out of nowhere. She went back to school for something else, something that suits her, and she found her own footing far away from her father's company. And the last note she sent me ended with a line I have kept. She wrote that getting fired by me was the first honest thing that had happened to her in her career, and the best. People ask me sometimes, when they hear the short version of this story, whether it felt good. The firing, the walking back in, the whole reversal of it. And they always seem a little disappointed by my answer, because they want me to say that it felt like victory, like vindication, like the satisfying snap of a trap closing on the people who deserved it. But that is not the part that stayed with me. The firings were necessary, and I did them cleanly, and then they were over, and they faded the way necessary, unpleasant things fade. What stayed with me, what I can still feel if I close my eyes, is the sound of an entire company on its feet, in 4 cities at once, applauding because someone had finally stood up and told them that their work had been seen, that they had been seen. I spent 12 years waiting for one person with power to turn around and see me. In the end, the only way I ever got it was to become that person myself, and then turn around and make absolutely certain that everyone behind me got to feel what I had waited so long to feel. That is the whole story. That is the only revenge that ever turned out to be worth having. Welcome to Karma Comes Calling, where every secret has a shelf life. This channel brings you powerful, emotionally charged stories of revenge, betrayal, justice, and truth. Each tale is crafted to pull you in, keep you listening, and leave you thinking long after the final twist. Sit back, listen closely, because at Karma Comes Calling, every secret has a shelf life.